A king who ruled millions was afraid of one thing: himself. Not his enemies, not his rivals, not even death, but the possibility that he might break. This fear seems ridiculous until you realize what it actually meant. And once you understand that, everything about power starts to look different. But this story doesn't start with a broken king. It starts with a broken kingdom and a child who thought he could fix it. France in 1380 was like a house falling apart while the family fought over who got to live in it. The country was broke. The people were angry. And somehow, an 11-year-old boy named Charles was supposed to fix everything. Most 11-year-olds worry about homework. Charles had to worry about keeping an entire kingdom from falling apart. Charles became king when his father, Charles V, died. People called his dad the Wise because he actually knew what he was doing. But wisdom doesn't pass down through blood. When Charles V died, he left behind a kingdom that was like an expensive car with no gas, broken windows, and 3 different people claiming they owned the keys. The war with England had been going on for decades. Soldiers tramped through French villages, eating everything in sight. Peasants paid taxes until their pockets were empty, then paid more taxes they didn't have. Bad weather ruined crops. People were hungry and desperate. Then there's the thing about desperate people. They don't stay quiet for long. Paris erupted in riots. Workers grabbed weapons and marched through the streets. The city became a dangerous place where angry crowds could turn violent at any moment. Meanwhile, Charles was just a kid. He couldn't even grow a proper beard yet, let alone make decisions about war and taxes, but his uncles stepped in to help. And by help, they meant to help themselves to everything valuable in the kingdom, like relatives who show up to help move but only carry the small boxes. These uncles treated the kingdom like their personal piggy bank. They threw expensive parties and gave their friends cushy jobs. The country's money disappeared faster than free pizza at a school lunch. Let's not forget the treasury situation. Visitors said they could see cobwebs in the money rooms because there wasn't enough gold left to keep the spiders away. France was going broke faster than a gambler on a losing streak. Charles watched all this happen around him. As he grew older, he became the kind of person people noticed. He was tall and strong with golden hair that caught the light. When he smiled, people smiled back. But charm doesn't pay bills or win wars. What nobody could predict was just how much pressure one young king could handle before something had to give. When Charles turned 20, he decided he was done watching his uncles destroy everything his father had built. Time to take control. Kicking out powerful relatives who control armies requires either incredible courage or incredible stupidity. Luckily for France, Charles had the first one. But Charles pulled it off. He told his uncles their services were no longer needed, which was the polite way of saying, "Get out before I throw you out." The young king had shown he could make tough decisions. The first thing Charles did was bring back his father's old advisors. These were men who actually knew how to run a country instead of just spending its money. France started to breathe again. The riots in Paris calmed down. People began to believe that maybe their new king actually cared about them. The streets became safer. Markets reopened. Charles worked to fix the economy. He made trade easier, lowered some taxes, and stopped wasteful spending. Money started flowing back into the kingdom instead of just flowing out of it. It was like cleaning up after a house party, except the house was France, and the mess included civil wars and empty treasuries. The military got better too. Charles hired competent generals. French armies started winning battles again. Other countries began to respect France as a real power. People loved their young king. When he rode through towns, crowds would gather to cheer. Then Charles got married to Isabeau of Bavaria. The wedding was a huge celebration that showed the world France was back on its feet. They had children quickly, but Charles was pushing himself harder than anyone realized. He worked from dawn until late at night. The pressure of ruling a kingdom was enormous, and Charles felt every bit of it. The court saw a confident, capable ruler. What they didn't see was a young man slowly wearing himself down. Charles was like a machine running too fast for too long. Everything looked fine on the outside, but inside parts were starting to break. What Charles didn't know was that the next time he left his palace, he wouldn't come back the same person. In 1392, Charles decided to personally lead an army to deal with a rebel who had tried to kill one of his advisors. It seemed like a straightforward mission. What could go wrong with a simple military expedition? Well, everything apparently. The summer heat was brutal, the kind of heat that made armor feel like an oven. Charles and his soldiers rode through forests under a sun that seemed determined to cook them alive. The pressure on Charles was enormous. He was dealing with the weight of being the king who had to prove he was strong enough to handle any threat. Every decision he made was watched by hundreds of men who depended on him. As they rode through a particularly dark forest, something in Charles's mind snapped. Without warning, he drew his sword and started attacking his own knights. The men he had been talking to moments before were suddenly his enemies. He slashed at them with deadly precision, killing several before anyone could react. Nothing ruins a military campaign quite like your commanding officer suddenly deciding you're all demons who need to be killed immediately. Then, just as suddenly as the violence had started, Charles stopped. He became completely still, staring into space like he was looking at something no one else could see. His sword dropped from his hands. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even seem to be breathing. For days, he stayed in this strange state. He wouldn't eat unless someone forced food into his mouth. He just stared at nothing, as if his mind had gone somewhere his body couldn't follow. The court panicked. Kings were supposed to be strong, stable, reliable. They weren't supposed to attack their own men and then turn into living ghosts. The doctors tried everything. They bled him, brought holy relics, and prayed over him. Nothing worked. Medieval medicine was basically throwing everything at the wall and hoping something stuck. In Charles's case, nothing did. Slowly, Charles began to come back. His eyes started to focus again. The doctors declared him cured, but everyone who had seen the episode knew something fundamental had changed. Charles tried to return to his normal duties, but he was different. He seemed nervous, uncertain. He would stop mid-sentence sometimes, as if listening to something no one else could hear. But this first breakdown was only the opening act. Charles's mind was about to show France something even stranger. Over the next few years, Charles's mind became like a door that wouldn't stay closed. Sometimes he was perfectly normal. Other times he slipped into a world that existed only in his head. The strangest delusion of all? Charles became convinced he was made entirely of glass. This wasn't just a passing thought. Charles truly believed his body was as fragile as a window. He was terrified that any sudden movement or touch would cause him to shatter into 1,000 pieces. He had iron support sewn into his clothes to protect his glass body. When people needed to speak with him, they had to keep their distance. No handshakes, no casual touches. Charles lived in constant fear of breaking himself. Being a glass king meant Charles had to rule without getting too close to his subjects. Social distancing, medieval style. The king refused to let anyone help him dress. He wouldn't ride horses because he might fall and shatter. He walked like he was carrying eggs, carefully placing each step. But here's the weird part. Charles wasn't the only one. Glass delusion was strangely common among wealthy people in medieval Europe. It was like a fashion trend, except instead of wearing funny hats, rich people convinced themselves they were made of breakable material. The court adapted as best they could. They spoke to Charles from across the room. They moved slowly and carefully in his presence. Talking to Charles meant speaking very softly from very far away, like trying to have a conversation in a library while standing in different rooms. But the glass delusion wasn't Charles's only problem. He also forgot things. Sometimes he forgot he was king. Sometimes he forgot his own name. On his good days, Charles could still be the capable ruler he had once been. Yet everyone knew the good days might not last. The kingdom began to function around Charles rather than through him. Important decisions were made by committees. The machinery of government learned to work even when the king wasn't fully present. While Charles retreated deeper into his fragile world, the people closest to him began eyeing the power he could no longer hold. With Charles lost in his own mind, the people around him saw an opportunity. When the king can't rule, someone else has to, and everyone thought they deserved to be that someone else. It was like a family fighting over who gets to drive the car while the owner sits in the back seat, convinced he's made of glass. Queen Isabeau stepped forward first. She argued that as Charles's wife, she understood what he would want. Meanwhile, Charles's brother Louis had different ideas. Then there was the Duke of Burgundy, who controlled huge amounts of territory and had his own army. None of them could agree on anything. What started as political disagreements quickly became personal hatred. Each person built their own networks of supporters and made alliances with foreign powers. France had become like a three-way tug of war where everyone was pulling so hard they forgot what they were fighting over. The situation exploded into actual civil war when Louis was murdered in Paris. Masked men attacked him with swords and axes, cutting off his hand and splitting his skull. Everyone knew Burgundy was behind it, but he denied everything. The murder divided French nobles into two camps. The Armagnacs supported Charles and Isabeau. The Burgundians supported the Duke of Burgundy. Paris became a war zone. Armed men roamed the streets. Nobles built private armies. The city that had been peaceful under Charles's early rule was now a place where anyone might be killed for supporting the wrong side. Civil war turned Paris into the medieval equivalent of a very dangerous neighborhood where wearing the wrong colors could get you killed. The Civil War consumed everything. Instead of fighting England, French armies fought each other. The kingdom that had been prospering was now bleeding money and people. Meanwhile, Charles sat in his royal chambers, mostly unaware of the chaos outside. On his bad days, he didn't know there was a civil war happening. On his good days, he could understand what was happening, but couldn't do anything about it. But the worst part? The people who were supposed to protect France were the ones destroying it. And while French nobles fought each other, a much bigger threat was getting ready to return. While France was busy destroying itself, England was getting ready to finish what it had started. King Henry V looked across the English Channel and saw opportunity. Henry arrived in France like someone showing up to buy a house while the current owners were too busy fighting each other to lock the front door. Henry landed in France in 1415 with a professional army. He wanted to conquer the entire kingdom and make himself the rightful king of France. The French response was a disaster. With Charles lost in his delusions and the nobles still fighting each other, nobody could organize a proper defense. At the Battle of Agincourt, Henry's army destroyed the French. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a massacre. French knights charged into English arrows and died in the mud. The flower of French nobility was cut down in a single afternoon. While his kingdom was being conquered, Charles was somewhere in his palace, probably wondering if that creaking floorboard might make him shatter. After Agincourt, Henry just kept winning. French cities surrendered without fighting. The English army marched deeper into France, taking territory that had been French for centuries. The Civil War made everything worse. Instead of uniting against the English, the French kept fighting each other. Some nobles even allied with the English against their fellow Frenchmen. Henry's strategy was brilliant and ruthless. He married Charles's daughter, Catherine, and negotiated the Treaty of Troyes, which was supposed to make him the rightful heir to the French crown. The treaty was basically a legal document that said France was giving up on being France. Under the treaty, Charles could keep his title as king, but Henry would become king after Charles died. Charles's son was declared illegitimate and cut out of the succession entirely. Queen Isabeau signed the treaty. She agreed to disinherit her own son to make peace with the English. Burgundy supported it too. But there was one small problem. The person who was supposed to be king of France thought he was made of glass. Charles signed the treaty, but nobody knew if he understood what he was signing. The English were now legally the rulers of France. All that remained was for Charles to die and make it official. But even with France legally surrendered and its king lost in madness, the story wasn't over. Sometimes the most unlikely people refused to accept defeat. Charles lived on for years after the Treaty of Troyes, trapped in a world that existed mostly in his own mind. Some days he was the Glass King, moving carefully to avoid shattering. Other days he forgot he was king at all. He became a living symbol of what had happened to France, broken but somehow still standing. The palace staff learned to work around their strange king. They fed him when he forgot to eat. They guided him when he got lost in his own home. Charles's condition became a strange kind of protection for the kingdom. The English couldn't officially take over as long as he was alive, but he was too sick to actually rule. France existed in a weird state of suspension. Meanwhile, the prince who had been disinherited refused to accept the Treaty of Troyes. Charles VII gathered supporters in the parts of France the English didn't control. He claimed to be the rightful heir, despite what his mother had signed. The abandoned prince was about to become the most important person in France. Yet that's a story for another time. When Charles finally died in 1422, he left behind a country that was almost lost but not quite defeated. History remembers Charles as the Mad, but maybe he was just a man who broke under pressure that would have broken anyone. He had tried to be the perfect king, the one who would fix everything wrong with France. Instead, he became the king who lost France entirely. Here's the strange thing. Even in his madness, Charles never completely gave up. He lived through decades of illness and confusion, but he never stopped being king. He never abdicated, never walked away, never handed over his crown. That stubborn refusal to quit would turn out to be exactly what France needed to survive. The Glass King had cracked, but he never fully shattered. And sometimes that's enough. Charles's reign proved that even broken kings can leave behind something valuable. His story shows how kingdoms survive their darkest moments and find unexpected ways to endure.